Last week we talked about direct effect, and I was tempted to include a section on state liability. In the end, I decided not to do that because of the differences in terms of how they think about the state. Within direct effect, we're really talking about emanations of the state, whereas this week with state liability, we're talking about the state itself, i.e., the UK or Italy or Germany or France. And that's quite a key and important difference. Nevertheless, there are some similarities, so let's start with those before moving on to state liability properly. So last week we spoke about how there are essentially two different types of direct effect. On the one hand, we have vertical direct effect, which goes up against the state or emanations of the state, as we discussed last week, and also horizontal direct effect, which goes side to side. So a person can enforce their rights either against other individuals or against private companies as well. And we talked about how this applies to the different types of EU law. So for treaty articles and regulations, it's quite straightforward. For directives, it's a little bit more difficult because we can have vertical direct effect against the state, but because it's an obligation on the state, there's no responsibility for individuals or companies. And so with directives, there's no horizontal direct effect. This was seen in full force in the case of Frankovich, so we've got a stereotype of our Italian person here. Frankovich worked at a bank and wanted to enforce his rights, so that would be horizontal direct effect because the bank was a private company. But because Frankovich was trying to enforce a directive, we know that with directives there is no horizontal direct effect. But of course, this doesn't really solve Frankovich's problems in any real sense. He's still stuck in a position where he's unable to enforce his rights under EU law. And so the EU itself is not really going to be a fan of this because it undermines the effect of the supremacy of EU law. So Frankovich went around this by suing the Italian state itself, and when it got to the European Court of Justice, they allowed the case. And so we have this principle of state liability, the liability of the state for not implementing a directive. Looking at the actual details and the ratio behind the case itself, we have to say that where a person is trying to enforce state liability, we have to be looking at a directive that gives rights to individuals. The rights have to be identifiable within the wording of the directive. And finally, and importantly, there has to be a causal link between the failure to actually implement the directive and the damage that has been suffered by the individual. So Frankovich obviously applied to directives, but we saw in the case of Brasserie du Pêcheur, which was also held alongside the UK case of Factortame, which you might have heard of, that state liability can apply to all forms of EU law. And Brasserie de Pêcheur also added that the breaches have to be sufficiently serious as well in order to attract state liability. A couple of final thoughts for you. This is probably going to be useful if you're thinking about writing an essay on this topic, although the links to Article 258 also can be useful in terms of a problem question as well. So judicial liability, we talked last week about indirect effect and how the courts themselves can be considered as part of the state. And so there is an interesting academic question that arises that, say for example, a judge is not abiding by EU law or is refusing to enforce EU law, can you bring a case of state liability against the judge themselves? On the one hand, this would seem fair because the individual is trying to enforce EU law and wants to be able to do that. But on the other hand, the state itself can't really be seen as liable because it's not responsible for the actions of judges under the separation of powers. So that's an interesting academic question that you might want to consider. Finally, the links to Article 258. If you haven't already checked out my video on Article 258, then do make sure that you do that. But it's really interesting. It's about the enforcement of EU law against the states themselves, but this comes from an enforcement point of view from the Commission. So the European Commission sees that a state hasn't implemented a directive, and they bring a case against the state asking them to implement it, and if they don't, then they're subject to a fine. Now, this is all fine, well and good, and ensures that EU law does get enforced and that directives do get implemented. But for private individuals, such as thinking about someone like Frankovich, there's not really a remedy there for them. When the state pays its fine, it pays it to the Commission rather than to any individuals. And so when you're considering perhaps an Article 258 question, you might want to think of state liability as an alternative remedy for private individuals so that they can claim damages. And there we have state liability. If this comes up in an exam or a coursework question, then you're going to be looking for a member state that has failed to implement a directive, and therefore there is no corresponding national law on which that individual can rely on. And so they have to look to state liability in order to get damages. Also, if you're looking at Article 258 in either a coursework or an exam question, then thinking about state liability is a really useful way to pick up some extra marks, and examiners will be really impressed if you've taken an Article 258 question and remembered that state liability can also apply in those circumstances. Well, thank you very much for watching this short video. If you did enjoy it, remember to leave a like, subscribe for more videos in the future, and if you have any questions, then leave those in the comments below. Have a good day. Bye!